It was 3 a.m. when Emma first woke up to the feeling that her blanket was trying to smother her. She had always felt safe in her room, tucked under the soft warmth of the colorful quilt her grandmother had sewn years ago. But tonight, there was something off about it. The blanket, once comforting, now felt unnervingly heavy, like something living, something that wasn't supposed to be there. It crept up her body, inching higher and tighter, the fabric shifting unnaturally, as though it had a mind of its own. As Emma's breathing became shallow, she tried to push it away, but it only seemed to wrap tighter, dragging her deeper into its suffocating embrace. Are you ready for a spine-chilling tale that will make you rethink every blanket you've ever slept under? Stay tuned and hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will keep you up all night. Emma was the kind of child who liked routines, simple and steady. She was the youngest of three, and her older siblings often teased her for being too serious or too quiet for a girl her age. They were louder, more adventurous, full of the energy that children usually had when they were in the midst of discovering the world. Emma, however, preferred the world that was predictable, the world where she knew what came next, where she could plan her days with precision and calm. Her parents, Sarah and Mark, often joked about how Emma's nature made her seem older than she was. She didn't rush into things. Instead, she took her time, considered her options, and observed before making decisions. Sarah liked to say that Emma was the type of child who would study the pattern on the floor before stepping on it, just to be sure it was safe. There was something inherently cautious about her, but also something deeply sensible. Emma found comfort in structure, knowing what to expect, when to expect it, and what was out of place when it didn't fit. But now, at 3 a.m., everything was wrong. The quiet rhythm of her room had been disrupted, and it was no longer safe. The blanket, her trusted companion for years, had become a force of dread. It was unlike any feeling she had ever experienced, and she didn't know what to make of it. Her heart pounded in her chest, the slow, deliberate beat echoing through the dark room as she tried to calm herself. The blanket had never done this before. Sure, sometimes she'd wake up tangled in it, but that was normal for a restless sleeper like her. This was something different. It was as if the blanket had become alive, and it had chosen her as its prey. Emma tried to sit up, to pull herself free, but her small hands couldn't find purchase on the fabric. It clung to her like something sentient, wrapping tighter around her legs and arms, pulling her down into the bed, as if it were trying to bury her alive. She could feel it press against her throat, a heavy weight, suffocating, constricting. The quilt's edges curled up and over her shoulders, its warm embrace now turning cold with fear. It wasn't a comforting hug. It was a prison. Her eyes darted around the room, desperate for something to help her make sense of this. The nightlight in the corner of the room flickered faintly, casting ghostly shadows against the walls. The darkness beyond that seemed to shift and stretch, bending the room into a place she no longer recognized. The quiet hum of the house, once so soothing, now felt deafening in its stillness. Everything felt wrong. With a final burst of effort, Emma yanked her arm free, her hand slipping through the fabric of the blanket, her fingertips grazing against the cool, unfamiliar threads. She gasped for air as she scrambled toward the edge of the bed. The blanket loosened for a moment, but only to coil back up in an even tighter knot, constricting around her chest. She had to scream, but the air felt thick in her lungs, her voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. It was then that she heard something, faint, distant, like a whisper coming from under the fabric. "Help me." Emma froze, her blood running cold at the sound of her own voice, yet not her voice at all. It was deeper, darker, like a whisper from someone or something hidden in the folds of the blanket. She reached for the lamp on her nightstand, but her hands trembled too much to grasp it. She tried again, but this time, the blanket shifted as if reacting to her movement, pulling back on her arm with a force she couldn't understand. Her eyes filled with tears, a mixture of confusion and fear that she couldn't contain. She was a child. She didn't know what was happening, but she felt like she was losing control. The blanket was no longer just a blanket. It was something more, something far more dangerous. The whisper came again, clearer now. "Help me." Emma's heart skipped a beat. and she knew that something terrible was happening, but she didn't understand it. She tugged at the fabric once more, only to feel it shift again. Closer, tighter, pulling her deeper into the suffocating embrace. It was no longer a comforting piece of cloth, but something more sinister. Something malevolent. She had no idea how or why, but she knew that the blanket was not just a thing, it was a presence. Her thoughts scrambled. She needed her parents. They had to help her, right? They always helped her when she was scared, but no one had come. No one had heard her cries. Suddenly, the door creaked open. Emma's head whipped toward the sound, and for a moment she thought it was her mother or father coming to rescue her. But the figure in the doorway was too dark, too indistinct. The room had begun to blur in her vision, and she could barely make out the shape standing there. Emma? The voice was faint, barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It was her mother, Sarah. "Mom, please?" Emma gasped, her voice breaking with panic. "Something's wrong. The blanket, it won't let me go." Sarah, standing in the doorway, stared at her daughter with wide, confused eyes. She didn't seem to understand what Emma was saying, as if the words made no sense. But Emma's desperate cries were enough to bring her closer, to reach out for her. But as Sarah stepped closer, Emma watched in horror as the blanket seemed to respond, shifting even more violently than before. Sarah froze in her tracks, confusion on her face turning into something darker. The quilt seemed to pulse and twist, and for a fleeting moment, Emma thought she saw a shape beneath it, something writhing, something alive. She screamed, "Mom, help me!" But her voice was drowned out by the strange rustling of the blanket, as if something inside it was stirring. Sarah stepped back, her hands trembling. "What's happening? What is this?" she whispered. Emma didn't have the words. She only had the feeling, the deep, unsettling certainty that whatever was in her room, whatever was wrapped around her, was not something they could fight. The days that followed Emma's terrifying night were strange. It wasn't that things had changed. No, nothing had truly changed. It was more that everything had shifted just enough to make the world seem unfamiliar. The quiet rhythm of their home had been disrupted, and for reasons Emma couldn't explain, she felt as if she were living in a different house entirely. Everything was the same walls, the same kitchen table, the same ticking of the old clock in the hallway, but something had been altered. Something beneath the surface had changed. It wasn't obvious, not yet. But it was there, lurking. Emma's parents didn't know what to think. Sarah had been in the room when Emma had cried out, but she hadn't seen anything, nothing that explained the bizarre happenings. She had dismissed it, convinced that Emma had simply been having a nightmare, an overactive imagination. But then the blanket had moved too, and they couldn't ignore that. It wasn't like when Emma had tossed and turned in her sleep. No, this was different. The blanket hadn't just shifted. It had moved on its own. It had wrapped tighter around Emma without any visible cause. Mark, Emma's father, had seen it too. He was more skeptical than Sarah, but there was no denying what had happened. He wasn't one to believe in things he couldn't explain. But then, he couldn't explain what had happened that night either. And so, after much discussion, they had decided to simply ignore it. They couldn't afford to dwell on things they didn't understand. It was just a blanket, after all. It didn't make sense, but then again, life rarely did. The next night, the blanket behaved itself. Emma slept soundly, curled beneath the quilt as she always had, and her parents dismissed the whole affair as an overblown reaction. They had to. Life was too busy for anything else. But then, the next evening, something happened again. Emma woke up with a jolt in the middle of the night. Her room was darker than usual. The moonlight, which had typically filtered through her curtains, seemed to have disappeared. The walls closed in, making the room feel smaller, tighter, more suffocating. She rubbed her eyes, blinking in the darkness, and her hands found the blanket. But this time, it wasn't where it should have been. It was tangled, twisted in ways she couldn't make sense of, as though it had been dragged to the far end of the bed. Emma sat up, her heart pounding. The weight on her chest was heavier now, like something pressing down on her. She reached out for the blanket, but as her fingers brushed against it, the fabric pulled away. She gasped and tried again, but the blanket slid further across the bed, as if it was moving on its own. She sat there, staring at it, unable to move. The longer she watched, the more it seemed as though the blanket was alive. It stretched out in all directions, like a living thing, seeking something, pulling itself closer to her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. The blanket twitched again, as though it had a will of its own, and Emma quickly pulled herself out of bed, her feet scrambling against the cold floor. Her heart hammered in her chest as she backed away from the bed, feeling her way toward the door. But the blanket was already moving. It was chasing her. Slowly at first, but then faster, wrapping itself around her legs, tugging at her, trying to pull her back. Emma screamed. She couldn't help it. She felt like a child again, lost in the dark, trapped by something she didn't understand. But the scream was cut short. The blanket suddenly stopped. It went still, like it had heard her, like it had paused to consider its next move. For a long moment, nothing happened. Emma stood frozen, her breath shallow, her body trembling. She watched the blanket, her eyes darting back and forth between it and the door. But then she heard something else. A faint sound, like a low hum, rising from beneath the blanket. It was barely audible at first, but as she stood there, it grew louder. And then, just as suddenly, the sound stopped. The blanket lay still, motionless, as if nothing had happened. But Emma could feel its presence, still watching her, still waiting. It wasn't over. She knew that. For the rest of the night, Emma lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The blanket remained where it was, unmoving, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, she tried to tell her parents, but they dismissed her once again. It was just a bad dream, they said. Kids have them all the time. But Emma wasn't convinced. She couldn't explain it, but she knew. The blanket wasn't just a blanket. Days passed. The blanket behaved itself again, at least on the surface. Emma tried to go on with her life. School, chores, family meals, everything seemed normal. But there was an undercurrent of something she couldn't ignore. The blanket, it haunted her, lurked at the edge of her thoughts, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting, watching. One evening, while her parents were downstairs preparing dinner, Emma decided to confront the blanket. She wasn't sure how she thought she could do that, but she knew she had to. She was tired of feeling like she was losing control of everything. So she marched up to her room, determined to prove that she could face it head on. As she entered the room, the blanket was lying in the middle of the bed, perfectly still. It seemed innocent enough. In the daylight, it was just a quilt. Nothing more, nothing less. But in the dim light of the evening, with the shadows casting long shapes across the room, Emma could feel it like a presence in the air. She stood there, staring at it, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her heart pounding. But then something unexpected happened. The blanket moved. Not much, just a little. A tiny twitch, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to send a chill down Emma's spine. She took a step back, but then she stopped herself. This was it. She wasn't going to run anymore. She wasn't going to let fear control her. With shaking hands, Emma reached for the blanket, but as her fingers brushed the fabric, it pulled away. Not violently, but with a purpose. It was as though the blanket had anticipated her movement, knew what she was going to do before she did it. Emma froze. She didn't know what to do. She felt trapped again, like the walls of her room were closing in on her, like there was no escape. But then the blanket moved once more, this time more deliberately, crawling across the bed toward her. It reached the edge of the mattress, curling up like a serpent preparing to strike. Emma stepped back, feeling the hairs on her neck stand up. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The room was so quiet, so still, and yet the blanket seemed to pulse with life, ready to consume her, to take her in and never let her go. She felt like she was suffocating, like she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, Then, everything stopped. The blanket stopped moving. The silence returned. Emma stared at it, her eyes wide with terror. What was this thing? Why was it doing this to her? She didn't understand. She couldn't. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she fought them back. She wasn't going to cry, but the fear, the overwhelming sense of dread was too much. She couldn't take it anymore. She ran. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to get away. The blanket, whatever it was still there, still watching, and she couldn't let it take her. She needed help. She needed someone to believe her. But no one did, and so she ran, but it followed, always. Days passed. The unsettling, creeping sensation that had followed Emma for so long was starting to take a heavier toll. Her nights were filled with fear, her days with exhaustion. She couldn't remember the last time she had slept soundly. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the blanket, its fabric twisting and turning, its edges shifting like a predator lurking in the shadows. Even during the daylight, Emma couldn't escape the feeling that it was still with her, waiting for her to make a mistake, to slip up. And each night, the blanket seemed to be waiting too. Waiting for her to get too tired, too complacent, so that it could strike. Her parents were growing concerned. Emma had always been a quiet child, but now she seemed different. She looked drained, her once bright eyes dull and shadowed. She had stopped eating much, often pushing her food around on her plate without ever taking a bite. She had become withdrawn, barely speaking unless absolutely necessary, her thoughts consumed by the ever-present, ever-waiting blanket. Her mother, Sarah, noticed. She had always known Emma to be a calm, collected child, and this sudden shift was not lost on her. At first, she chalked it up to the stress of school or perhaps some underlying anxiety Emma hadn't mentioned. But then, she started noticing things, strange things. The way Emma would look over her shoulder at the bed when they were in the living room, the way she would stand in the doorway of her room, eyes wide with an unspoken fear, before retreating back to the safety of the hall. It wasn't just that Emma was acting distant. It was something else, something deeper. Sarah spoke to Mark about it, but Mark dismissed her worries. He told her that Emma was just going through a phase, that it was nothing to be concerned about. He hadn't witnessed what Sarah had seen. He hadn't seen the blanket move. It was just a child's imagination, he insisted. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. One evening, when Emma had slipped into her room without a word, Sarah couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in her gut anymore. She had to see for herself. She had to know if it was just Emma's imagination or something else entirely. Sarah knocked softly on Emma's door, but there was no response. She opened it slowly, the door creaking on its hinges. The room was dim, the light from the hallway spilling across the floor. It was quiet, eerily so. Emma was sitting on her bed, her back turned, staring at the wall. Her posture was stiff, rigid, as though she was afraid to move. The blanket, the one that had been tormenting Emma for so long, was lying motionless at the foot of the bed, like a silent observer. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. She wasn't sure what she expected, but it wasn't this. "Emma?" she called softly. "Are you okay?" Emma didn't move. She didn't even flinch at the sound of her name. It was as if she hadn't heard her mother at all. Sarah stepped closer, her footsteps barely audible on the thick carpet, but as she reached the edge of the bed, Emma finally spoke. "It's waiting," Emma whispered, her voice distant, hollow. "It's always waiting." The words struck Sarah like a slap. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what Emma meant, but she understood the fear in her daughter's voice. It was the same fear she had seen in her own eyes every time she looked at the blanket. She had to act. "Emma, listen to me," Sarah said gently, kneeling beside the bed. "You need to tell me what's going on. We'll fix it. Together, we'll fix it." But Emma didn't respond. Instead, her gaze seemed to fixate on something beyond Sarah, something far away. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, her hands gripping the edge of the bed so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The room suddenly felt colder, and Sarah shivered involuntarily. She glanced at the blanket and her blood ran cold. It was moving, very slowly, as if it was being stirred by an unseen hand. The fabric rippled, twisted, and then it pulled itself closer to Emma, curling up at the foot of the bed, as if it had a will of its own. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but then it became more pronounced. The blanket slithered toward Emma, inch by inch, its edges reaching out like fingers, seeking her out. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stood frozen, unable to move. She didn't know what to do. This was no longer just a strange occurrence. It was something worse. "Emma!" Sarah shouted, shaking her daughter by the shoulders. But Emma didn't react. Her body was stiff, her face frozen in a mask of terror. The blanket crept closer, its fabric brushing against Emma's leg, then wrapping around her like a cold, suffocating embrace. "Help me," Emma whispered, barely audible, her voice breaking. But it was too late. The blanket had already taken her. Sarah didn't know how she found the strength to move, but she did. She grabbed Emma by the arms, yanking her away from the bed, pulling her into her arms with a force that surprised even herself. The blanket immediately released its grip on Emma, falling to the floor in a heap, but Sarah could feel its presence, still there, lingering in the room. They ran out of the room, down the stairs, and into the living room. Mark was sitting on the couch, watching the news, oblivious to the terror that had just unfolded upstairs. He looked up, startled, as Sarah burst into the room with Emma clutched to her chest. "What's wrong?" he asked, confused. "Why are you?" But Sarah didn't let him finish. "It's real," she said, her voice trembling. "It's real. The blanket, it's alive, Mark. It's not just Emma's imagination. It's not." Mark stared at her, his brow furrowed, disbelief clouding his features. "Sarah, what are you talking about? You're not making sense." "No, you don't understand," Sarah insisted, her voice shaking. "The blanket, it's been moving on its own. I saw it. It's trying to take her." Mark's face hardened. He was still skeptical, but there was something in Sarah's eyes that he couldn't ignore. He stood up from the couch, pacing the room. He had never been one to believe in things he couldn't explain. But this was different. Something about the way Sarah was looking at him, something about the fear in her voice, made him pause. "I'll go up and check," Mark said, his voice quiet. "But if this is just another one of Emma's episodes..." "It's not an episode," Sarah snapped, cutting him off. "It's real." Mark hesitated, then nodded. "I'll check." Sarah grabbed his arm as he passed her. "Don't go in there alone, please. It's not safe." He looked at her, his face hard with resolve. "I'll be fine." But Sarah wasn't so sure. Upstairs, Mark entered Emma's room. The blanket was still lying in the same spot where Emma had left it, unmoving. He took a step closer, inspecting it carefully. There was nothing strange about it, nothing that suggested anything unnatural. It was just a blanket, just fabric. But then, as Mark reached out to touch it, the blanket shifted again, slowly, as though it was testing him. Mark recoiled, his heart suddenly racing. He couldn't explain it, but he knew something was wrong. The blanket was alive, and he had no idea how or why, but it was there, in that room, waiting for them. "Sarah," Mark shouted, his voice laced with fear, "you were right, it's real." But it was too late. The blanket had already wrapped itself around him. And that's where we'll leave it for today, but the story is far from over. If you're feeling the chill creeping up your spine, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notifications so you never miss the next part of this terrifying tale. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Drop a comment below if you think you know what's really going on with that blanket. Let's see who's got the best theory. And remember, if you're brave enough, keep watching. Because the creepiest stories always have a way of finding you when you least expect it. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay safe out there. You never know what's lurking in the shadows.